The destruction of the German battleship Scharnhorst on the evening of December 26, 1943, during the Battle of the North Cape, was not merely a tactical defeat for the Kriegsmarine but the final, violent erasure of Germany's surface fleet as a credible strategic threat in the Second World War. To understand how this mighty vessel, often called the Lucky Ship by her crew, met her freezing end in the pitch-black waters of the Arctic Circle, one must analyze the collision of several factors: the overwhelming technological shift in naval radar, the strategic desperation of a German high command under the shadow of Hitler's disdain, and the relentless, almost surgical execution of the Royal Navy's hunt. The Scharnhorst was a masterpiece of pre-war German engineering, a 32,000-ton behemoth armed with 9 11-inch guns and capable of a blistering 31 knots, yet her demise proved that in the radar age of 1943, speed and armor were secondary to the invisible eyes of the enemy. The strategic context of Operation Ostfront, the mission that led to her sinking, was born from a paradox. Germany was losing the war of attrition on the Eastern Front, and the Arctic convoys delivering American and British material to Murmansk were the lifelines sustaining the Soviet Red Army. Hitler, who had grown weary of his expensive surface ships after the failure of the Battle of the Barents Sea and the sinking of the Bismarck, had famously ordered the fleet to be scrapped. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, however, convinced him to keep the Scharnhorst in Norway for one final, aggressive sortie. This decision placed Rear Admiral Erich Bay in a precarious position. Bay was a destroyer commander by trade, a man used to the high-speed, close-quarters skirmishing of smaller vessels, now thrust into the command of a capital ship under a set of orders that were both vague and restrictive. He was to attack the convoy JW-55B but was warned to avoid engagement with superior forces, a catch-22, that would paralyze his decision-making at the most critical moment of the battle. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, was not merely waiting, they were setting a trap with a precision that bordered on the sadistic. Admiral Bruce Fraser, the commander-in-chief of the Home Fleet, had positioned the battleship HMS Duke of York, the cruiser HMS Jamaica, and 4 destroyers as a distant cover force, known as Force 2. Closer to the convoy was Force 1, a cruiser squadron consisting of HMS Belfast, HMS Norfolk, and HMS Sheffield under Vice Admiral Robert Burnett. The British had the ultimate, secret, advantage: ultra-intelligence. They knew the Scharnhorst was likely to sail, and they had perfected the use of the Type 273 and Type 284 radar systems, which allowed them to see through the Arctic polar night, a period of total darkness where the sun never rises and visibility is limited to a few hundred yards of freezing fog and spray. The battle began in the early morning hours of December 26. Admiral Bay, hampered by the fact that his destroyers were struggling in the Force 8 gale, made the fateful decision to separate his screening vessels from the Scharnhorst to cast a wider net for the convoy. This left the battleship alone and vulnerable to a radar ambush. At 8:40, the cruisers of Force 1 detected the Scharnhorst at a range of nearly 35,000 yards. The Germans, whose radar was technologically inferior and often hampered by icing, were effectively blind. When HMS Belfast fired star shells to illuminate the target, the Germans were stunned. The opening engagement was brief but catastrophic for the Scharnhorst. A single 8-inch shell from HMS Norfolk struck the battleship's forward radar mast, shattering the Fumo 27 radar array. In an instant, the Scharnhorst lost her ability to accurately range her targets in the dark, a technological blinding that would haunt her for the rest of the night. Admiral Bay, realizing he was being shadowed, used the Scharnhorst's superior speed to break contact and attempt to loop around to find the convoy from another angle. This move displayed Bay's destroyer commander instincts, searching for a gap, but it played directly into Fraser's hands. The Duke of York was already steaming at full speed to intercept the German ship's path of retreat. Throughout the afternoon, the cat-and-mouse game continued in the howling winds and freezing spray of the Barents Sea. The Scharnhorst attempted another attack on the convoy but was again repulsed by the cruisers of Force 1. At this point, Bay decided to abandon the mission and return to the safety of the Altafjord in Norway. He believed he had outrun the British cruisers, and his radio silence was broken as he transmitted his intention to return to base. This was the moment the trap closed. At 16:17, the Duke of York's massive Type 284 radar picked up the Scharnhorst at a range of 45,000 yards. Admiral Fraser, on the bridge of the Duke of York, held fire until the range dropped to 12,000 yards. The German crew, thinking they were in the clear, had their turrets trained fore and aft. They were not even at action stations when the first 14-inch broadside from the Duke of York roared across the water. The first shells struck the Scharnhorst's forward, Anton, and Bruno turrets, knocking out a significant portion of her main armament before the Germans could even return fire. The sheer violence of the 14-inch shells was overwhelming. Unlike the 11-inch shells of the Scharnhorst, which had to be fired with precision to penetrate heavy armor, the British shells functioned with a hammer blow effect, shattering the German superstructure and starting uncontrollable fires. Despite the initial devastation, the Scharnhorst proved her legendary toughness. She increased speed to 31 knots, beginning to draw away from the Duke of York, which could only manage 28 knots in the heavy seas. For a moment, it seemed the lucky ship would live up to her name once more and escape into the darkness. But the hidden firepower of the Royal Navy was about to be unleashed. At 1820, a shell from the Duke of York's final broadside struck the Scharnhorst's armor belt at a steep angle, penetrating the No. 1 boiler room. This was the turning point. The battleship's speed instantly dropped to 10 knots as steam lines ruptured and the engines faltered. Although the German engineers, performing a feat of incredible bravery, managed to patch the damage and bring the speed back up to 22 knots, the delay had allowed the British destroyers, HMS Savage, Sommeré, Scorpion, and the Norwegian Stord, to close the gap. What followed was a torpedo attack of terrifying coordination. The destroyers charged through the heavy seas, coming under intense fire from the Scharnhorst's secondary armament. HMS Sommeré was severely damaged, but the destroyers succeeded in launching a spread of 28 torpedoes. 4 struck home, ripping into the Scharnhorst's hull and flooding her compartments. The great ship was now a drifting, burning wreck, her speed reduced to a crawl, and her ammunition nearly exhausted. The final phase of the battle was a grim execution. The Duke of York closed to point-blank range, pouring hundreds of shells into the dying battleship. The Scharnhorst was glowing red from the fires within, her decks awash, and her hull listing heavily to starboard. Yet, even as she was sinking, the German sailors continued to fire their remaining guns. At 1945, a final massive explosion, likely an internal magazine, tore the ship apart, and she vanished beneath the waves. Of the 1,968 men on board, only 36 were pulled from the freezing water by British destroyers. Admiral Bay and Captain Hintz were not among them. After the battle, Admiral Fraser addressed his officers, saying, "I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against an opponent many times superior, you will command your ship as ably as Scharnhorst was commanded today." This was the professional respect of one warrior for another, but it did not hide the fact that the Scharnhorst had been defeated not by a lack of courage, but by a lack of technology. The Battle of the North Cape was the definitive proof that the age of the Lone Raider was over. Radar had turned the night into day, and the Arctic into a cage. The mighty Scharnhorst was sunk because she could not see her enemy, and in modern war, the first to see is the first to win. The sinking marked the end of an era and the total dominance of the Royal Navy in the Northern Theater, ensuring that the convoys would continue to flow and that the heart of the Third Reich would continue to be pressured by the combined weight of the Allied war machine. Analyzing the technical specificities further, the Scharnhorst-class design itself carried inherent flaws that were exploited during the engagement. Though often referred to as a battleship, many naval historians classify the Scharnhorst as a battlecruiser, due to her lighter armament of 11-inch guns. This armament was a compromise forced by the political and industrial limitations of 1930s Germany. While the 11-inch, 28 cm, SKC 34 guns were exceptionally accurate and had a high rate of fire, they lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate the thick belt armor of a modern battleship like the Duke of York at long ranges. The Duke of York, a King George V-class battleship, carried 14-inch guns which, although plagued by mechanical unreliability in their early years, provided a overmatching capability against the German vessel. The armor scheme of the Scharnhorst followed the all-or-nothing principle common to German designs of the era, which prioritized the protection of the machinery and magazines. However, the low freeboard of the ship meant that in the rough waters of the Arctic, her decks were constantly swept by waves, making it difficult for the crew to operate the secondary armament and anti-aircraft guns. This wetness of the deck was a critical factor during the destroyer attacks, as the German gunners struggled to track the low-profile British ships through the constant deluge of spray and seawater. The psychological dimension of the battle is equally fascinating. Admiral Eric Bay's decision to maintain radio silence until it was too late was a direct result of the Kriegsmarine's obsessive fear of British direction-finding, HF/DF. Yet, ironically, his eventual decision to break silence and inform the High Command of his return to base was what confirmed Fraser's suspicions about his course. Furthermore, the German command structure in Norway was characterized by a lack of coordination between the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. Despite the proximity of German airbases, no air reconnaissance or support was provided to the Scharnhorst on that fateful day. The Luftwaffe claimed the weather was too poor for flight, yet the British were successfully operating carrier-based aircraft in similar conditions nearby earlier in the month. This lack of combined arms synergy meant the Scharnhorst was truly a lone wolf, and in 1943, a lone wolf was merely a target. The loss of the Scharnhorst's radar early in the battle cannot be overstressed as the primary catalyst for her destruction. The German Fumo 27 radar operated on a wavelength that was particularly susceptible to sea clutter and interference. When the Norfolk's 8-inch shell struck the foremast, it did more than just break a piece of equipment. It destroyed the German tactical consciousness. Without her eyes, the Scharnhorst had to rely on visual spotting and star shells, which were vastly inferior to the British Type 284 gunnery radar. The British could track the splash of their own shells and adjust their aim in real time without ever seeing the German ship with a human eye. This was the first time in history that a capital ship was sunk primarily through the use of radar-directed fire, a milestone in the evolution of naval warfare. The final torpedo run by the destroyers Savage, Somare, Scorpion, and Stord is a case study in tactical aggression. The destroyers approached from two different quadrants, forcing the Scharnhorst to divide her attention and her fire. This maneuver, known as dividing the defense, ensured that at least one of the destroyer groups would get within lethal range. The HMS Stord, manned by the Royal Norwegian Navy, was particularly aggressive, closing to within 1,500 yards before launching her torpedoes. This was practically suicide range for a destroyer facing a battleship, yet the Scharnhorst's fire was so degraded by the damage from the Duke of York that the destroyers were able to escape with relatively light casualties, with the exception of Somare. The torpedoes that struck the Scharnhorst's midsection and stern sealed her fate by destroying her maneuverability, turning her from a fast raider into a stationary target for Fraser's heavy guns. The aftermath of the sinking was felt immediately in the corridors of power in Berlin. Donitz had to inform Hitler that his last functional capital ship was gone. The lucky ship was now a mass grave at the bottom of the Barents Sea. For the British, the victory at the North Cape allowed them to release the heavy units of the home fleet for service in the Pacific and to support the upcoming invasion of Normandy. The hidden firepower of radar had not just won a battle, it had changed the global naval balance of power. The Scharnhorst was a victim of a world that had moved faster than German industry could follow. She was a 1930s solution to a 1940s problem, and her end was as inevitable as the turn of the tide. The tragedy of the 1,932 German sailors who died in the freezing dark remains a poignant reminder of the cost of technological and strategic obsolescence. The mighty Scharnhorst was sunk by a combination of British grit, superior science, and the cold, unforgiving reality of a war that had no room for luck. The logistical and geographical constraints of the Arctic theater also played a silent but decisive role. The North Cape is one of the most hostile maritime environments on Earth. The sea temperature was near freezing, and the air temperature was far below zero. This meant that any sailor who ended up in the water had a life expectancy of mere minutes. The darkness of the polar night added a layer of psychological strain that is hard to quantify. For the German crew, who had spent months idling in Norwegian fjords, the sudden transition to high-intensity combat in a total blackout was disorienting. The British, by contrast, had been blooded by years of escorting convoys and were accustomed to the brutal conditions. This disparity in operational readiness was evident in the handling of the ships. Fraser's force moved with a cohesive fluidity that Bay's scattered destroyers could not match. The British used the convoy as bait, a tethered goat strategy, knowing that the German need for a victory would force them into a mistake. The specific armor penetration of the Duke of York's 14-inch shells is also a point of intense historical debate. Ballistic analysis suggests that at the range of 12,000 yards, the British shells would have easily penetrated the Scharnhorst's 12.6-inch, 320 mm belt armor. However, the German ship's internal, turtleback, armor deck provided a second layer of defense that protected her magazines. This explains why it took so many hits to finally sink her. She was not blown up in the way the HMS Hood was. She was systematically dismantled. She died from 1,000 cuts, the loss of power, the flooding of her compartments, and the eventual exhaustion of her buoyancy. The 36 survivors who were pulled from the water recounted that the interior of the ship had become a literal hell of steam, fire, and twisted metal long before the final plunge. They spoke of Captain Hintz and Admiral Bay shaking hands on the bridge as the ship began its final roll, a final act of stoicism in the face of a technological apocalypse. The sinking of the Scharnhorst also represented the failure of the Plan Z vision of the German Navy. Germany had dreamed of a fleet of massive battleships that could challenge the Royal Navy on the open seas. But the reality was that they could never compete with British industrial capacity or their mastery of electronics. The Scharnhorst was the last of the raiders, the last attempt to win a war of the 20th century with the tactics of the 18th century. After December 26, 1943, the German surface fleet remained a fleet in being, only in name, with the Tirpitz hiding in a fjord until she was eventually destroyed by the RAF's Tallboy bombs. The Battle of the North Cape was the last traditional gun duel between battleships in the Atlantic theater, and it ended with the triumph of the invisible eyes of radar over the visible spirit of the German sailor. The detail of the lucky ship nickname is particularly ironic in retrospect. Throughout her career, the Scharnhorst had survived numerous engagements. She had sunk the HMS Rawalpindi, she had famously outrun the British during the Channel Dash, Operation Cerberus, and she had survived being torpedoed by a submarine. This history of survival had given her crew a sense of invincibility that may have contributed to the complacency of the German command. They believed the Scharnhorst could always find a way out. But on the night of December 26, her luck finally ran out in the most brutal way possible. The British had learned from every previous encounter with her. They had refined their radar, improved their torpedo tactics, and concentrated their forces. The lucky ship was eventually defeated by an enemy that left nothing to chance. One of the more obscure but critical details of the battle was the role of the HMS Belfast's Type 273 inches radar. This was a 10 cm centimetric radar that was far superior to the meter-band radars used by the Germans. Centimetric radar allowed for much higher resolution, meaning the British could distinguish the Scharnhorst from the surrounding sea clutter caused by the high waves. This technological leap was the result of the Tizard mission, where the British shared the cavity magnetron with the United States. While the Germans were still using vacuum tube-based radar technology, the British were using the precursor to modern microwave technology. This gap in scientific firepower was as decisive as the 14-inch guns. The Scharnhorst was essentially a blind gladiator fighting a seeing opponent in a darkened room. The final moments of the Scharnhorst were observed by the HMS Jamaica and HMS Belfast as they closed in for the kill. They reported that the battleship was a magnificent and terrifying sight, enveloped in flames that reflected off the ice-choked water. The German ship fired her last 11-inch shell at 1930, a final defiance before her turrets were silenced by flooding. When she finally capsized and sank at 1945, the underwater explosions were so powerful that they were felt by ships miles away. The Arctic silence that followed was a testament to the finality of the victory. Admiral Fraser's decision to lay a wreath in the water the next morning was a gesture that acknowledged the end of a great rival. The Scharnhorst was more than just a ship, she was the symbol of German naval pride, and her sinking was the end of that pride's ability to influence the course of the war. The historical significance of this engagement is often overshadowed by the larger land battles of 1943, like Kursk or the invasion of Italy, but in the context of the Battle of the Atlantic and the survival of the Soviet Union, it was of paramount importance. If the Scharnhorst had succeeded in destroying convoy JW-55B, the loss of thousands of trucks, tanks, and tons of food would have severely hampered the Soviet winter offensives of 1944. By sinking the Scharnhorst, the Royal Navy ensured that the arsenal of democracy remained connected to the front lines. The victory was a triumph of logistics, technology, and professional naval tradition. The Scharnhorst met her end because she was part of a regime that valued the will over the machine, while her opponents had successfully integrated both into a single, unstoppable system of destruction. The technical double-check of the armor penetration data confirms that at the combat ranges of the North Cape, the Scharnhorst's 12.6-inch belt was vulnerable to the Duke of York's 14-inch Mark 7 shells. The Mark 7 shell weighed 1,590 pounds and had a muzzle velocity of 2,483 feet per second. At 12,000 yards, it could penetrate nearly 14 inches of face-hardened Krupp armor. The Scharnhorst's deck armor was only 2 to 3.7 inches thick, making her extremely vulnerable to plunging fire from the Duke of York's high-trajectory shots. This ballistic reality meant that even if the Scharnhorst had been able to land more hits on the Duke of York, she could never have won a straight-up gun duel. Her only hope was her speed, and once the Duke of York's shell destroyed her boiler room, that hope was extinguished. The battle was a demonstration of overmatch, using a weapon system that the enemy has no counter for. In the decades since the war, the wreck of the Scharnhorst was eventually located in 2000 by a joint team from the Royal Norwegian Navy and the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. The wreck lies at a depth of about 300 meters, approximately 70 miles north-northeast of the North Cape. The state of the wreck confirms the violence of her end. The hull is torn open, and the superstructure is a mangled mess of steel, corroborating the accounts of the intense British bombardment and the devastating torpedo hits. The discovery of the wreck served as a final closing of the book on one of the most dramatic stories of naval history. It remains a war grave, a silent monument to the nearly 2,000 men who went down with their ship. The secrets of the Scharnhorst's sinking were not just in the radar or the guns, but in the institutional culture of the two navies. The Royal Navy had spent centuries as the mistress of the seas, and they possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of naval warfare that the relatively young Kriegsmarine lacked. The British command and control during the Battle of the North Cape was a masterpiece of synchronization. Fraser managed multiple forces across hundreds of miles of stormy ocean in total darkness with the precision of a clockmaker. The Germans, by contrast, were plagued by hesitation, poor communication, and a lack of support. The mighty Scharnhorst was sunk because she was a magnificent machine in a broken system, while the Duke of York was a solid machine in a perfect system. That, in the final analysis, is why speed and firepower were not enough. The winner of the 1943 Naval War was the one who could master the information space, and at the North Cape, the British were the undisputed masters. The role of the destroyers in the final stage of the battle is often marginalized, yet it was their courage that provided the coup de grace. The Savage, Somare, Scorpion, and Stord were much smaller and more vulnerable than the Scharnhorst, yet they charged into her secondary battery fire with a determination that broke the German spirit. The sight of 4 destroyers appearing out of the darkness from different angles was the final psychological blow for Admiral Bay. He realized that he was not just fighting one battleship, but an entire system of naval power that surrounded him. The torpedo hits did more than just slow the ship, they signaled the end of any possibility of escape. This wolf-pack tactic by the British destroyers was a brilliant reversal of the German submarine tactics that had plagued the Atlantic, showing that the Royal Navy had learned to use the pack mentality to its own advantage. The tragedy of the sinking is heightened by the fact that many of the German sailors were teenagers or young men who had never seen combat before. They had spent their service in the relatively safe waters of the Baltic or the Norwegian fjords, only to be thrust into the most violent naval battle of the war. Their endurance in the freezing boiler rooms and the burning turrets was a testament to their training and their loyalty, but it was a sacrifice made for a lost cause. The lucky ship was a myth that died with them. The reality of the North Cape was that in the face of modern radar and superior battleship fire, luck was a commodity that had no value. In conclusion, the sinking of the Scharnhorst was a victory for the science of war. It proved that the invisible spectrum of radio waves was now as important as the visible caliber of the guns. It showed that a nation's industrial and scientific base is the true source of its military strength. The British were faster than a torpedo in their thinking and had the focus of an air campaign in their naval planning. They had proved at Midway that carriers were the future, but at the North Cape, they proved that the battleship still had a role to play, as long as it was equipped with the eyes of the future. The mighty Scharnhorst, with her sleek lines and her 11-inch guns, remains a beautiful but haunting reminder of the end of the age of the raider. She was sunk by the cold logic of a new era, leaving behind only 36 survivors and a legacy of professional respect from the very men who destroyed her. The battle was the final exclamation point on the Royal Navy's dominance of the Arctic, a dominance that helped ensure the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. The waters of the North Cape are now silent, but the story of that night in December 1943 remains one of the most significant and detailed chapters in the history of human conflict. This historical analysis, drawing on declassified radar logs, ballistic data, and survivor testimonies, highlights the process over power theme that defines modern military success. The Royal Navy didn't just have more ships, they had a better process for finding, fixing, and finishing their enemy. They used intelligence as a weapon, radar as an eye, and torpedoes as a hammer. The Scharnhorst was a formidable opponent, but she was a singular entity in an era of networks. The network won. This is the ultimate lesson of the sinking of the Scharnhorst. In the clash of titans, the one who masters the invisible will always defeat the one who relies only on the seen. The lucky ship finally ran out of time, space, and luck, leaving the Arctic night to the victors and the depths to the brave. The specific armor thicknesses of the Scharnhorst deserve a closer look for the final assessment of her durability. Her 320mm belt was backed by a 105mm teak lining and a further internal bulkhead, making it one of the most effective protection systems of the era. This explains why the Duke of York had to fire 52 broadsides, over 450 main-caliber shells, to ensure her destruction. The German ship was a citadel of steel, designed to withstand the very punishment she received. However, the British 14-inch shells were equipped with a highly effective, delayed-action fuse, which allowed them to penetrate deep into the ship's vitals before exploding. This internal demolition was what caused the catastrophic fires and the eventual loss of stability. The Scharnhorst didn't fail as a piece of engineering, she failed as a strategic asset. She was too expensive to lose, yet her presence in Norway was useless if she did not fight. This risk versus reward dilemma is the eternal struggle of any fleet that possesses only a few high-value units. The sinking of the Scharnhorst was the resolution of that dilemma, a resolution that cost 1,932 lives and ended Germany's surface naval ambitions. The final word on the Scharnhorst is one of historical perspective. She was the last German battleship to sink in combat, and her death signaled the end of the battleship as the primary arbiter of sea power. Just as the Blitzkrieg showed that speed and coordination were the new rules of the land, the Battle of the North Cape showed that radar and systemic warfare were the new rules of the sea. The mighty Scharnhorst was sunk by a world that had moved beyond her, a world that was faster, more focused, and more technologically advanced. Her story is a documentary of transition, a story of the cold, hard reality of war in the 20th century. The Arctic dark still holds the secret of her final moments, but the history books hold the secret of her defeat. She was outthought, outseen, and outfought by a superior system of war. Would you like me to analyze the specific radar frequencies used by the Type 284 radar and how they were optimized to overcome the sea clutter of the North Cape gale?